Louise had always been an attention-seeking woman, though she would never admit it herself. Her marriage to John had seemed secure, stable, and comfortable, perfect at first glance. However, the spark that had once ignited their relationship had long since faded. John, immersed in the routine of his demanding job, did not notice Louise sinking into deep dissatisfaction. Days slowly turned into monotonous weeks, and those in turn merged into months of loneliness. She spent her time in a huge house in the suburbs, longing for some of the new emotions and vibrant feelings that had once filled her life. One hot summer evening, Louise decided to pamper herself. She filled the bathtub with hot water and left the window open, letting the warm breeze mix with the steam. Sinking into the waves, she tried to leave all her cares outside the tub, but suddenly a shadow outside the window caught her attention. It was Tommy, her neighbor, who had stepped out onto the balcony to water the flowers. His gaze happened to meet Louise's, and at that moment, an unknown, forbidden thrill sprang up in his heart. Tommy was a good man, sensitive and observant by nature. He was always interested in the world around him, and Louise had always intrigued him with her elegant nature and subtle sadness. That evening, his eyes glazed over when he saw her, and he couldn't look away from a gaze that clearly reflected what they both felt, a moment full of electrified silence. Louise, embarrassed, quickly pulled back the curtain in an effort to hide her embarrassment. But thoughts of that moment stayed with her. She wondered if he had seen everything, and why it was so important to her. That same evening, despite the shame rising in his chest, Tommy returned to his house, tormenting himself with thoughts of Louise, unable to get her image out of his mind. The next day, when Louise looked out the window again, she felt uneasy. She began to watch Tommy's house with the same wariness with which a fisherman waits for the right moment to cast his rod. Another part of her, which she had long prepared for new sensations, felt a rush of excitement. John continued, not noticing no change in Louise, as if everything was still the same. He kissed her cheek goodbye as he left for work, leaving her alone with her unspoken desires and the emptiness left behind. Louise caught herself again thinking that life wasn't just about maintaining the status quo. She wanted change. Gradually, Louise realized that her feelings for Tommy were more than just a passing liking. She met his gaze that day, and he triggered a bond in her that she didn't even realize she had. Soon they met again, and the moment of their gaze literally spoke volumes, of desire, of understanding. These feelings rushed out like a raging torrent, and Louise, full of uncertainty, realized that they could lead to something more, something magical. One day, sitting over a cup of coffee with Lisa, her best friend, Louise caught herself thinking that maybe this was just an unforgivable infatuation. Lisa had certainly noticed the change, and although Louise tried to evade the question, her friend was already aware of the new storm in her life. As she stepped outside in the evening, the light of the evening sun filled the space around her. The faces of passers-by were forming into a familiar pattern, and Louise's heart beat again in a rhythm of anticipation. Once again she saw Tommy, their gazes met, and all that was said without words. The trembling in her soul and the anticipation could no longer remain hidden. Every moment of their communication gave her hope, but also tremendous fear. All the feelings that had been building up in her heart were now bursting out. She knew she had to be honest, but something in her was afraid of the consequences. Still, life was a game of fire, and perhaps it was time for the spark to reignite. It could be the start of something new and wonderful, something that would lift her above the usual monotony. Louise realized, if she didn't take it into her own hands, she would miss a chance that could change her entire life. Opening her heart, Louise stepped into the unknown, ready to accept all the consequences. Though doubts and fears stood in her way, she was willing to fight for her happiness. Life had given her hope, which meant that anything was possible. Louise couldn't get rid of the image of Tommy that haunted her mind, joining her every morning and evening. Their casual glances filled her heart with new meaning, and for weeks she thought again and again of the moment when their gazes had crossed. This unresolved tension only fueled the desire in her chest. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness fell, she saw him standing beside the flowering bushes outside. Her heart beat faster, as if the night itself was whispering to her to go to him. She took a step forward, summoning the courage to call out to him. Tommy turned around and insight sparkled in his eyes and his lips spread into a slight smile when he saw her. Their conversation had been light and casual at first, dealing with simple topics, but there was something deeper in the air, some unspoken desire rising in the room. Louise stammered as they exchanged pleasantries until she decided to say more. "Tommy, we need to talk." It was more than just friendly words, it was a call that realized itself. Tommy hesitated for a moment, but then became serious. His hand gently touched her arm, the touch sent ripples throughout her body, currents of tenderness and excitement. Everything inside her woke up. She felt that their relationship was beginning to take a different turn, and it was both gratifying and frightening. His quiet question, spoken with slight uncertainty, "Are you sure you want to do this?" reminded her of how twisted and complicated it all was. But already in that moment, Louise realized, for these weeks she'd been living in anticipation, and the only answer she could give was for her to get closer to him. As she stepped closer, Tommy's lips met hers, first softly and then with growing passion. That kiss made her forget her misfortunes and what awaited her at home. The following weeks became one long intermittent spark for Louise as she and Tommy literally burst into the moment, capturing every hidden glance and stolen kiss. Their secret romance blossomed into moments filled with warm tenderness and sincere passion, but along with them came the guilt that settled in the shadows like an unseen observer. Every evening when John came home from work tired and distracted, Louise tried to portray an ordinary life. He was unaware of her brief encounters. Sometimes she came to her senses too late, realizing that behind every moment of happiness there was a dark side. She noticed how her emotional world, once based on stability and certainty, was suddenly filled with hesitation and fear. Louise tried to hide the change within herself, even as her thoughts of Tommy became insistent and restless. She could feel this new reality forcing her further and further away from John. All the times she'd supported him, when she tried to find comfort for him, had become a perpetual game of forgetting herself in the wilds of feelings crossing over where she shouldn't have been. One night, when Louise couldn't stand her inner struggle, she decided to step forward. Clutching her short robe and walking down the cold path from behind her house, she headed toward Tommy. Her heart pounded in unison with anticipation. She knew it would create new waves of emotion, but she couldn't contain herself any longer. Her soul craved the power of what they could create together. Louise realized that by stepping into this space, they would cross a boundary that she herself was drawn to. But could she forgive herself for wanting to be with the man who brought joy into her life, even if it undermined her stability? She walked towards him with a clear intention, no matter what, to finally open her heart's desire, and embrace the sudden happiness that had unexpectedly returned to her life. The moment she arrived at his door, Louise knew perfectly well, this evening she was willing to risk everything for the gentle light that lit her heart. Deep down, she knew it could change her life forever. Waves of emotion raged inside her with fear and hope, but she was ready to fight for the right to be happy. Louise stood at Tommy's door, her heart pounding as if in a frenzied dance. She felt that this moment was the culmination of all her hidden desires and hopes. Making sure no one was around, she inhaled his familiar scent. Relief and hope filled her chest. Tommy opened the door, and a spark flashed in his eyes that sounded like a loud signal. Before her stood a man capable of melting the ice that had formed in her soul. In an instant they were in each other's arms, her hand went to his, and an invisible bond was born between them. It was the holy moment of comfort and tranquility they had both been waiting for. Louise felt her boring routine full of regimentation finally recede, leaving only the excitement and magic of the moment. They stood as if the whole world around them had ceased to exist, everything they needed was so close. When their lips met, it was like a flash of light in the darkness. The kiss was gentle at first, almost elusive, before it was filled with passion. Louise was forgetting her life, which had once only included John. Every moment in Tommy's arms was weightier than ever before. This was the day she felt alive, finally not just a wife, but a woman, desired and loved. Tommy grabbed her in his arms and carried her gently into the bedroom. Louise burrowed into his arms, feeling the warmth of his body and throwing away all her worries. He was her salvation, a gentle refuge from the world, and the moment he laid her on the bed, her heart filled with happiness and excitement. But along with that came a sense of inevitability that no one could ignore. However, as time went on, Louise began to notice a wonderful change in her friends and John. Each week she witnessed her friend Lisa begin to spend more time with John, and every time she smiled at him or touched him, there was a cold stirring of jealousy in Louise's chest. Lisa had always been there for John, supporting him, protecting him from the world, and now those gestures were becoming more and more intimate, creating fear and resentment in Louise's heart. Louise realized that this had become a confusing game that she couldn't ignore. The question swirled in her mind over and over again: what if she ever found out? From time to time her anguish turned to reproach. When John tried to pay attention to her, she could barely hold back an angry look mixed with humiliation. Every nuance of her life she encountered became unbearable. Tommy was her light in this confusing darkness, but with every kiss came guilt. At times like these, she felt like she was carrying a heavy load, unable to push past the boundaries she'd created herself. The passion and desire that had been burning between her and Tommy had intensified to the breaking point. Meanwhile, John noticed more and more of a change in Louise. He was getting lost in his work worries, but his wary glances could no longer ignore her distance. He noticed how she often left later in the day, and her attention to him became less genuine. On one such cold night, when John came home early from work and decided to surprise Louise with dinner, she was unprepared for what happened next. She, coming to her senses after a ton of worry, didn't even notice how the somber air of the upcoming meeting filled her. Its string of moments of waiting on the edge stretched on, and they both didn't know how to take steps forward. Opening the door, John saw his wife whispering in Tommy's ear without hesitation or anger. It was something he had never expected. The smells of the food left on the table mixed easily with the atmosphere of tension, and he felt uneasy. In an instant, Louise's happiness ended as he met Tommy's menacing gaze. They faced each other as if facing a duel. But fate had already woven its web, and looking over her mistakes, Louise knew she could no longer carry on with the life she had become accustomed to. She could no longer hide the truth that was about to surface, threatening to destroy everything she had left behind. The truth hidden in the shadows of their secrets would inevitably come to light all around them, and the hero's time had come. They would have to decide which of them would fight for true love and which would settle for destruction. Thus, everything that happened poured out in golden and moody moments, along with the smell of baking, laughter, and the hidden horror that waits around the corner. Louise and John stood on the brink, and their fate depended on which road they chose ahead.